Ranger Jansen immediately radioed Helena, informing them of the situation, and requested doctors, litters, and plasma to treat the burn victims. Next, he organized a rescue party from Hersey's 19-man crew, which had been driven off their fire lines, and put Hersey in charge of the fire camp. Jansen then moved the rescue party downriver to the mouth of Rescue Gulch to await the arrival of the doctors. Doctors T.L. Hawkins and R.E. Haynes volunteered to answer the call for medical help. Shortly after 9 p.m., they and an ambulance left Helena, and a short time later arrived at the gates of the mountain's boat launch. A boat was waiting and took them downriver to Rescue Gulch. But when they met up with Jansen's rescue party, they realized they'd forgotten the litters back at the boat launch and were forced to make a hasty return to retrieve them from the ambulance. But finally, at 11:30 p.m., the 12-man rescue party started up the hill. Back at the Canyon Ferry Ranger District office, Lois Jansen had been watching the huge smoke plume develop to the west and eavesdropping on the radio messages. She heard bits and pieces of radio conversation and mentioning the fire blowing up, and then later that men were injured and missing on the fire. Lois would spend a sleepless night trying to keep her children calm, but worrying about Bob, Jim Harrison, and the other firefighters she knew who were sweating out the evening and early morning hours. August 6th, 1949. Two-thirds of the way up the hill in Rescue Gulch, Jansen's rescue party spotted a flashlight above them in the midst of the smoke and fire. It was Walt Rumsey coming down to the river for more water for a dehydrated and thirsty Bill Hellman. Slowly making their way up the slope, with Rumsey in tow, the party reached Hellman at 12:35 a.m. The doctors immediately began treating Hellman. They administered morphine, treated and bandaged his burns, wrapped him in a blanket, and laid him on one of the litters. Shortly after the doctors began treating Hellman, Ranger Jansen with Bob Sallee and a few other men headed up to the ridge line and over into Mann Gulch to find the other injured smoke jumper. In the steep terrain, thick smoke and darkness, it took over an hour to find Joe Sylvia. But finally at 1:50 a.m., they located him, still conscious, perched atop that big boulder. Awaiting the arrival of the two physicians, Jansen and the small crew kept up a running conversation with Sylvia, who, despite his burns, remained talkative. They gave him small sips of water from their canteens. Bob peeled an orange and hand-fed it to Joe because Joe's fingers had been reduced to charred stubs. Sylvia complained of the cold, so Bob and the other boys stripped off their thin summer shirts and T-shirts to cover Joe to keep him warm. But Joe was still cold, so they too climbed up on the boulder and, disregarding the awful odor of burned flesh, pressed their bodies two at a time against Joe, trying to keep him warm. It took nearly 2 hours for the doctors to treat Bill Hellman's wounds, hike up to the ridge line, and then pick their way down to Sylvia and begin treating his injuries. Joe had been sitting atop that big boulder with second and third degree burns over 80% of his body, occasionally slipping in and out of consciousness for over 8 hours. After the doctors had finished treating Sylvia, the decision was made to wait until first light to begin moving the two injured jumpers off the hill. With Sylvia stabilized, Jansen and the rescue crew immediately spread out across the hillside and began searching for the other missing 11 smoke jumpers. Not far from Sylvia's boulder, Bob would find Jim Harrison's body, recognizing it from his Catholic medal, the Forest Service key and badge he had issued Jim only weeks earlier. As soon as the first weak light started to illuminate the smoky eastern sky, at about 4:40 a.m., the rescue parties headed down the hill for the Missouri River. Joe Sylvia carried out the mouth of Mann Gulch, and Bill Hellman carried down out of Rescue Gulch. Both parties were met by boats, and the men were transported upriver to the boat landing, transferred to awaiting ambulances, and then rushed to St. Peter's Hospital in Helena. Though there was initial optimism about their chances of survival, their lungs and airways were severely compromised, and by early afternoon, both men died from their injuries. As soon as the injured jumpers had been transferred to the boats for transport upriver to the boat landing, Wag Dodge joined Jansen and the rescue crew, and the group climbed back up into Mann Gulch to continue to search for survivors or bodies. Bob and the rescue crew spent the balance of Saturday, August 6th, hiking up and down and back and forth across the hillsides in Mann Gulch and Rescue Gulch to the north, trying to complete the gruesome task of finding and trying to identify the remaining casualties, and then packing them to the saddle at the head of Mann Gulch for transport via small helicopter to the gates of the mountain's boat landing. In the broiling August sun, amidst choking smoke, Ranger Jansen hiked the slopes until he had painful blisters on both feet. Jansen and his crew continued searching through the day, but were unable to find the 13th body until the following day, Sunday, August 7th, around noon. On this same Sunday, August 7th, 1949, another towering rainstorm swept across the continental divide and across the Helena Valley. But unlike the previous storm, this one brought only rain. The much-needed moisture checked the fire's progress, but it still took 450 men working out of 5 fire camps 3 more days to control the stubborn blaze. In the end, the fire burned nearly 5,000 acres of grass and timber on Ranger Jansen's district and on some local ranches. But like many fatal fires before 1949, and several fires that have followed, the Mann Gulch fire would not be remembered for the acreage burned, but for the lives lost.